Louis Althusser. Louis Pierre Althusser was a French Marxist philosopher. He was born in Algeria and studied at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he eventually became professor of philosophy. Althusser was a long-time member, although sometimes a strong critic of the French Communist Party. His arguments and theses were set against the threats that he saw attacking the theoretical foundations of Marxism. These included both the influence of empiricism on Marxist theory and humanist and reformist socialist orientations which manifested as divisions in the European Communist parties, as well as the problem of the cult of personality and of ideology. Althusser is commonly referred to as a structural Marxist, although his relationship to other schools of French structuralism is not a simple affiliation, and he was critical of many aspects of structuralism. Althusser's life was marked by periods of intense mental illness. In 1980, he killed his wife, the sociologist Hélène Rittmann, by strangling her. He was declared unfit to stand trial due to insanity and committed to a psychiatric hospital for 3 years. He did little further academic work, dying in 1990. Althusser was born in French Algeria in the town of Bermendries, near Algiers, to a pied noir petit bourgeois family from Alsace, France. His father, Charles Joseph Althusser, was a lieutenant officer in the French army and a bank clerk, while his mother, Lucienne Marthberger, a devout Roman Catholic, worked as a schoolteacher. According to his own memoirs, his Algerian childhood was prosperous. Historian Martin J. said that Althusser, along with Albert Camus and Jacques Derrida, was a product of the French colonial culture in northern Africa. In 1930, his family moved to the French city of Marseille as his father was to be the director of the company Algerienne de Banque branch in the city. Althusser spent the rest of his childhood there, excelling in his studies at the Lycée Saint-Charles and joining a scout group. A second displacement occurred in 1936 when Althusser settled in Lyon as a student at the Lycée du Parc. Later he was accepted by the highly regarded higher education establishment École Normale Supérieure in Paris. At the Lycée du Parc, Althusser was influenced by Catholic professors, joined the Catholic youth movement Jeunesse étudiante chrétienne, and wanted to be a Trappist. His interest in Catholicism coexisted with his communist ideology, and some critics argued that his early Catholic introduction affected the way he interpreted Karl Marx. After a 2-year period of preparation under Jean Guiton at the Lycée du Parc, Althusser was admitted into the ENS in July 1939. But his attendance was deferred by many years because he was drafted to the French army in September of that year in the run-up to World War II and, like most French soldiers following the fall of France, was captured by the Germans. Seized in Vannes in June 1940, he was held in a prisoner of war camp in Schleswig-Holstein, in northern Germany, for the 5 remaining years of the war. In the camp, he was at first drafted to hard labor but ultimately reassigned to work in the infirmary after falling ill. This second occupation allowed him to read philosophy and literature. In his memoirs, Althusser described the experiences of solidarity, political action, and community in the camp as the moment he first understood the idea of communism. Althusser recalled, "It was in prison camp that I first heard Marxism discussed by a Parisian lawyer in transit and that I actually met a communist." His experience in the camp also affected his lifelong bouts of mental instability, reflected in constant depression that lasted until the end of life. Psychoanalyst Elizabeth Rau-Dienesko has argued that the absurd war experience was essential for Althusser's philosophical thought. Althusser resumed his studies at the ENS in 1945 to prepare himself for the aggregation, an exam to teach philosophy in secondary schools. In 1946, Althusser met sociologist Hélène Rittmann, a Jewish former French resistance member with whom he was in a relationship until he killed her by strangulation in 1980. That same year, he started a close friendly relationship with Jacques Martin, a G.W.F. Hegel and Hermann Hesse translator, who later committed suicide and to whom Althusser dedicated his first book. Martin was influential on Althusser's interest on reading the bibliography of Jean Cavales, Georges Canguilhem, and Hegel. Although Althusser remained a Catholic, he became more associated with left-wing groups, joining the worker priests movement and embracing a synthesis of Christian and Marxist thought. This combination may have led him to adopt German idealism and Hegelian thought, as did Martin's influence and a renewed interest on Hegel in the 1930s and 1940s in France. In consonance, Althusser's master thesis to obtain his Diplôme d'études supérieures was on content in the thought of G.W.F. Hegel. Based on the phenomenology of spirit, and under Gaston Bachelard's supervision, Althusser disserted on how Marx's philosophy refused to withdraw from the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. According to the researcher Gregory Elliott, Althusser was a Hegelian at that time but only for a short period. In 1948, he was approved to teach in secondary schools but instead made a tutor at the ENS to help students prepare for their own aggregation. His performance on the exam, he was the best ranked on the writing part and second on the oral module, guaranteed this change on his occupation. He was responsible for offering special courses and tutorials on particular topics and on particular figures from the history of philosophy. In 1954, he became secrétaire de l'École littéraire, assuming responsibilities for management and direction of the school. Althusser was deeply influential at the ENS because of the lectures and conferences he organized with participation of leading French philosophers such as Gilles Deleuze and Jacques Lacan. He also impacted a generation of French philosophers and French philosophy in general. Among his students were Derrida, Pierre Bourdieu, Michel Foucault, and Michel Serres. In total, Althusser spent 35 years in the ENS, working there until November 1980. Parallel to his academic life, Althusser joined the French Communist Party in October 1948. In the early post-war years, the PCF was one of the most influential political forces and many French intellectuals joined it. Althusser himself declared, "Communism was in the air in 1945, after the German defeat, the victory at Stalingrad, and the hopes and lessons of the resistance." Althusser was primarily active on the peace movement section and kept for a few years his Catholic beliefs. For example, in 1949 he published in the L'Évangile captif, the 10th book of the Jeunesse de l'Église, an article on the historic situation of Catholicism in response to the question, "Is the good news preached to the men today?" In it, he wrote about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the labor movement, advocating at the same time for social emancipation and the church religious reconquest. There was mutual hostility between these two organizations in the early 1950s. The Vatican prohibited Catholics from membership in the worker priests and left-wing movements, and it certainly affected Althusser since he firmly believed in this combination. Initially afraid of joining the party because of ENS's opposition to communists, Althusser did so when he was made a tutor when membership became less likely to affect his employment, and he even created at ENA the Circle Politzer, a Marxist study group. Althusser also introduced colleagues and students to the party and worked closely with the communist cell of the ENS. But his professionalism made him avoid Marxism and communism in his classes. Instead, he helped students depending on the demands of their aggregation. In the early 1950s, Althusser distanced himself from his youthful political and philosophical ideals and from Hegel, whose teachings he considered a bourgeois philosophy. Starting from 1948, he studied history of philosophy and gave lectures on it. The first was about Plato in 1949. In 1949-1950, he gave a lecture about René Descartes, and wrote a thesis titled Politics and Philosophy in the 18th Century and a small study on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Second Discourse. He presented the thesis to Jean Hippolyte and Vladimir Jankelevich in 1950, but it was rejected. These studies were nonetheless valuable because Althusser later used them to write his book about Montesquieu's philosophy and an essay on Rousseau's The Social Contract. Indeed, his first and the only book-length study published during his lifetime was Montesquieu, La politique et l'histoire in 1959. He also lectured on Rousseau from 1950 to 1955, and changed his focus to philosophy of history, also studying Voltaire, Condorcet and Helvétius, which resulted in a 1955-1956 lecture on Les problèmes de la philosophie de l'histoire. This course, along with others on Machiavelli, 17th and 18th century political philosophy, Locke, and Hobbes were later edited and released as a book by François Mathurin in 2006. From 1953 to 1960, Althusser basically did not publish on Marxist themes, which in turn gave him time to focus on his teaching activities and establish himself as a reputable philosopher and researcher. Althusser resumed his Marxist-related publications in 1960 as he translated, edited, and published a collection directed by Hippolyte about Ludwig Feuerbach's works. The objective of this endeavor was to identify Feuerbach's influence on Marx's early writings, contrasting it with the absence of his thought on Marx's mature works. This work spurred him to write on the young Marx, Theoretical Questions. Published in the journal La Pensée, it was the first in a series of articles about Marx that were later grouped on his most famous book for Marx. He inflamed the French debate on Marx and Marxist philosophy, and gained a considerable number of supporters. Inspired by this recognition, he started to publish more articles on Marxist thought. For example, in 1964, Althusser published an article titled Freud and Lacan in the journal La Nouvelle Critique, which greatly impacted the Freudo-Marxism thought. At the same time, he invited Lacan to a lecture on Baruch Spinoza and the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. The impact of the articles led Althusser to change his teaching style at the ends, and he started to minister a series of seminars on the following topics: on the young Marx, the origins of structuralism, Lacan and psychoanalysis, and reading Capital. These seminars aimed for a return to Marx and were attended by a new generation of students. For Marx and Reading Capital, both published in 1965, brought international fame to Althusser. Despite being widely criticized, these books made Althusser a sensation in French intellectual circles and one of the leading theoreticians of the PCF. He supported a structuralist view of Marx's work, influenced by Cavales and Canguilhem, affirming that Marx left the cornerstones of a new science, incomparable to all non-Marxist thought, of which, from 1960–1966, he espoused the fundamental principles. Critiques were done to Stalin's cult of personality, and Althusser defended what he called theoretical anti-humanism, as an alternative to Stalinism and the Marxist humanism, both popular at the time. At mid-decade, his popularity grew to the point that it was virtually impossible to have an intellectual debate about political or ideological theoretical questions without mentioning his name. Althusser's ideas were influential enough to arouse the creation of a young militants group to dispute the power within the PCF. Nevertheless, the official position of the party was still Stalinist Marxism, which was criticized both from Maoist and humanist groups. Althusser was initially careful not to identify with Maoism but progressively agreed with its critique of Stalinism. At the end of 1966, Althusser even published an unsigned article titled On the Cultural Revolution, in which he considered the beginning of the Chinese Cultural Revolution as a historical fact without precedent and of enormous theoretical interest. Althusser mainly praised the non-bureaucratic, non-party, mass organizations in which, in his opinion, the Marxist principles regarding the nature of the ideological were fully applied. Key events in the theoretical struggle took place in 1966. In January, there was a conference of communist philosophers in Choisy-le-Roi. Althusser was absent, but Roger Garaudy, the official philosopher of the party, read an indictment that opposed the theoretical anti-humanism. The controversy was the pinnacle of a long conflict between the supporters of Althusser and Garaudy. In March, in Argenteuil, the thesis of Garaudy and Althusser were formally confronted by the PCF Central Committee, chaired by Louis Aragon. The party decided to keep Garaudy's position as the official one, and even Lucien Sévé, who was a student of Althusser at the beginning of his teaching at the ends, supported it, becoming the closest philosopher to the PCF leadership. General Secretary of the party, Waldeck Rochet, said that communism without humanism would not be communism. Even if he was not publicly censured nor expelled from the PCF, as were 600 Maoist students, the support of Garaudy resulted in a further reduction of Althusser's influence in the party. Still in 1966, Althusser published in the Cahiers pour l'analyse the article on the social contract, a course about Rousseau he had given at the ends, and Cremonini, painter of the abstract about Italian painter Leonardo Cremonini. In the following year, he wrote a long article titled The Historical Task of Marxist Philosophy that was submitted to the Soviet journal Voprosy Philosophiae. It was not accepted but was published a year later in a Hungarian journal. In 1967–1968, Althusser and his students organized an ENS course titled Philosophy Course for Scientists that would be interrupted by May 1968 events. Some of the material of the course was reused in his 1974 book Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists. Another Althusser's significant work from this period was Lenin and Philosophy, a lecture first presented in February 1968 at the French Society of Philosophy. During the events of May 1968, Althusser was hospitalized because of a depressive breakdown and was absent in the Latin Quarter. Many of his students participated in the events, and Regis Debray in particular became an international celebrity revolutionary. Althusser's initial silence was met with criticism by the protesters, who wrote on walls, "Of what use is Althusser?" Later, Althusser was ambivalent about it. On the one hand, he was not supportive of the movement and he criticized the movement as an ideological revolt of the mass, adopting the PCF official argument that an infantile disorder of anarchistic utopianism that had infiltrated the student movement. On the other hand, he called it the most significant event in Western history since the resistance and the victory over Nazism and wanted to reconcile the students and the PCF. Nevertheless, the Maoist journal La Cause du Peuple called him a revisionist, and he was condemned by former students, mainly by Jacques Rancière. After it, Althusser went through a phase of self-criticism that resulted in the book Essays in Self-Criticism, in which he revisited some of his old positions, including his support of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. In 1969, Althusser started an unfinished work that was only released in 1995 as Sur la reproduction. However, from these early manuscripts, he developed Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, which was published in the journal La Pensée in 1970, and became very influential on ideology discussions. In the same year, Althusser wrote Marxism and Class Struggle that would be the foreword to the book The Basic Concepts of Historical Materialism of his former student, the Chilean Marxist sociologist Marta Harnecker. By this time, Althusser was very popular in Latin America. Some leftist activists and intellectuals saw him almost as a new Marx, although his work has been the subject of heated debates and sharp criticism. As an example of this popularity, some of his works were first translated to Spanish then into English, and others were released in book format first in Spanish and then in French. At the turn from the 1960s to the 1970s, Althusser's major works were translated into English for Marx, in 1969, and Reading Capital in 1970, disseminating his ideas among the English-speaking Marxists. In the early 1970s, the PCF was, as most of European communist parties, in a period of internal conflicts on strategic orientation that occurred against the backdrop of the emergence of Eurocommunism. In this context, Althusserian structuralist Marxism was one of the more or less defined strategic lines. Althusser participated in various public events of the PCF, most notably the public debate Communists, Intellectuals, and Culture in 1973. He and his supporters contested the party's leadership over its decision to abandon the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat during its 22nd Congress in 1976. The PCF considered that in European condition it was possible to have a peaceful transition to socialism, which Althusser saw as a new opportunistic version of Marxist humanism. In a lecture given to the Union of Communist Students in the same year, he criticized above all the form in which this decision was taken. According to Althusser, echoing his notion of French misery exposed on for Marx, the party demonstrated a contempt for the materialist theory when it suppressed a scientific concept. This struggle ultimately resulted in the debacle of the Fraction Union of the Left and an open letter written by Althusser and 5 other intellectuals in which they asked for a real political discussion in the PCF. That same year Althusser also published a series of articles in the newspaper Le Monde under the title of What Must Change in the Party. Published between 25 and April 28, they were expanded and reprinted in May 1978 by François Maspero as the book Ce qui n'est pas plus dur dans le Parti communiste. Between 1977 and 1978, Althusser mainly elaborated texts criticizing Eurocommunism and the PCF. Marx in His Limits, an abandoned manuscript wrote in 1978, argued that there was no Marxist theory of the state, and it was only published in 1994 in the Écrits philosophiques et politiques I. The Italian communist newspaper Il Manifesto allowed Althusser to develop new ideas on a conference held in Venice about power and opposition in post-revolutionary societies in 1977. His speeches resulted into the articles The Crisis of Marxism and Marxism as a Finite Theory, in which he stressed something vital and alive can be liberated by this crisis, the perception of Marxism as a theory that originally only reflected Marx's time and then needed to be completed by a state theory. The former was published as Marxism Today in the 1978 Italian Encyclopedia Europea. The latter text was included in a book published in Italy, Discutere lo Stato, and he criticized the notion of government party and defended the notion of a revolutionary party out of state. During the 1970s, Althusser's institutional roles at the ends increased, but he still edited and published his and other works in the series Theory, with François Maspero. Among the essays published, there was Response to John Lewis, a 1973 reply of an English communist's defense of Marxist humanism. 2 years later, he concluded his doctorat d'état in the University of Picardy Jules Verne and acquired the right to direct research on the basis of his previously published work. Some time after this recognition, Althusser married Hélène Rittmann. In 1976, he compiled several of his essays written between 1964 and 1975 to publish Positions. These years would be a period in which his work was very intermittent. He gave a conference titled The Transformation of Philosophy in 2 Spanish cities, first Granada and then in Madrid, in March 1976. The same year he gave a lecture in Catalonia titled Quelques questions de la crise de la théorie marxiste et du mouvement communiste international, in which Althusser outlined empiricism as the main enemy of class struggle. He also started a rereading of Machiavelli that would influence his later work. He worked between 1975–1976 on Machiavel et Nous, a draft, only published posthumously, based on a 1972 lecture, and also wrote for the National Foundation of Political Science a piece titled Machiavelli's Solitude. In spring 1976, requested by Leon Chertok to write for the International Symposium on the Unconscious at Tbilisi, he drafted a presentation titled The Discovery of Dr. Freud. After sending it to Chertok and some friends, he was unsettled by the requested criticism he received by Jacques Nassif and Raul Dinesco, and then, by December, he wrote a new essay, on Marx and Freud. He could not attend the event in 1979 and asked Chertok to replace the texts, but Chertok published the first without his consent. This would become a public affair in 1984 when Althusser finally noticed it, by the time Chertok republished it in a book titled Dialogue Franco-Soviétique, sur la psychanalyse. After the PCF and the left were defeated in the French legislative elections of 1978, Althusser's bouts of depression became more severe and frequent. For example, in March 1980, Althusser interrupted the dissolution session of the École Freudienne de Paris, and, in the name of the analysts, called Lacan beautiful and pitiful harlequin. Later, he went through a hiatal hernia removal surgery as he had difficulties breathing while eating. According to Althusser himself, the operation deteriorated his physical and mental state. In particular, he developed a persecution complex and suicidal thoughts. He would recall later, "I wanted not only to destroy myself physically but to wipe out all trace of my time on earth, in particular, to destroy every last one of my books and all my notes, and burn the École Normale, and also, if possible, suppress Hélène herself while I still could." After the surgery, in May, he was hospitalized for most of the summer in a Parisian clinic. His condition did not improve, but in early October he was sent home. Upon returning, he wanted to get away from Enns and even proposed to buy Raul Dinesco's house. He and Hélène were also convinced about the human decline, and so he tried to talk to the Pope John Paul II through his former professor Jean Guiton. Most of the time, however, he and his wife spent locked on their ends apartment. In the fall of 1980, Althusser's psychiatrist René Dietkind, who by now was also treating Althusser's wife Hélène, recommended that Althusser be hospitalized, but the couple refused. On November 16, 1980, Althusser strangled Hélène in their ends room. He himself reported the murder to the doctor in residence who contacted psychiatric institutions. Even before the police arrival, the doctor and the director of ENS decided to hospitalize him in the St. Anne Hospital, and a psychiatric examination was conducted on him. Due to his mental state, Althusser was deemed to not understand the charges or the process to which he was to be submitted, so he remained at the hospital. The psychiatric assessment concluded he should not be criminally charged, based on Article 64 of the French Penal Code, which stated that there is neither crime nor delict where the suspect was in a state of dementia at the time of the action. The report said Althusser killed Hélène in the course of an acute crisis of melancholy, without even realizing it, and that the wife murder by manual strangulation was committed without any additional violence, in the course of iatrogenic hallucinatory episode complicated by melancholic depression. As a result, he lost his civil rights, entrusted to a representative of the law, and he was forbidden to sign any documents. In February 1981, the court ruled Althusser as having been mentally irresponsible when he committed the murder, therefore he could not be prosecuted and was not charged. Nonetheless, a warrant of confinement was subsequently issued by the Paris Police Prefecture. The Ministry of National Education mandated his retirement from the ENS, and the ENS requested his family and friends to clear out his apartment. In June, he was transferred to the L'Ovive clinic at Soisy-sur-Seine. The murder of Hélène attracted much media attention, and there were several requests to treat Althusser as an ordinary criminal. The newspaper Minute, journalist Dominique Jamet and Minister of Justice Alain Perfit were among those who accused Althusser of having privileges because of the fact he was communist. From this point of view, Raoul Dinesco wrote, Althusser was 3 times a criminal. First, the philosopher had legitimated the current of thought judged responsible for the Gulag. Second, he praised the Chinese Cultural Revolution as an alternative to both capitalism and Stalinism, and finally because he had, it was said, corrupted the elite of French youth by introducing the cult of a criminal ideology into the heart of one of the best French institutions. Philosopher Pierre-André Taguieff went further on, claiming Althusser taught his students to perceive crimes positively, as akin to a revolution. 5 years after the murder, a critic by Le Monde's Claude Serrault would have a great impact on Althusser. She compared his case to the situation of Issei Sagawa, who killed and cannibalized a woman in France, but whose psychiatric diagnosis absolved him. Serrault criticized the fact that, when prestigious names are involved, a lot is written about them but that little is written about the victim. Althusser's friends persuaded him to speak in his defense, and the philosopher wrote an autobiography in 1985. He showed the result, L'Avenir dure longtemps, to some of his friends and considered to publish it, but he never sent it to a publisher and locked it in his desk drawer, and the book was only published posthumously in 1992. Despite the critics, some of his friends, such as Guiton and Debray, defended Althusser, saying the murder was an act of love, as Althusser argued too. Hélène had bouts of melancholy and self-medicated because of this. Guiton said, I sincerely think that he killed his wife out of love of her. It was a crime of mystical love. Debray compared it to an altruistic suicide. He suffocated her under a pillow to save her from the anguish that was suffocating him. A beautiful proof of love, that one can save one's skin while sacrificing oneself for the other, only to take upon oneself all the pain of living. In his autobiography, wrote to be the public explanation he could not provide in court, Althusser stated that she matter-of-factly asked me to kill her myself, and this word, unthinkable and intolerable in its horror, caused my whole body to tremble for a long time. It still makes me tremble. We were living shut up in the cloister of our hell, both of us. The crime seriously tarnished Althusser's reputation. As Ďáčko wrote, from 1980, he lived his life as a spectre, a dead man walking. Althusser forcibly lived in various public and private clinics until 1983, when he became a voluntary patient. He was able to start an untitled manuscript during this time. In 1982, it was later published as The Underground Current of the Materialism of the Encounter. From 1984 to 1986, he stayed at an apartment in the north of Paris, where he remained confined most of his time, but he also received visits from some friends, such as philosopher and theologian Stanislas Breton, who had also been a prisoner in the German stalags, from Gittin, who converted him into mystic monk in Ďáčko's words, and from Mexican philosopher Fernando Navarro during 6 months, starting from the winter of 1984. Althusser and Navarro exchanged letters until February 1987, and he also wrote a preface in July 1986 for the resulting book, Filosofía y Marxismo, a collection of her interviews with Althusser that was released in Mexico in 1988. These interviews and correspondence were collected and published in France in 1994 as Sur la philosophie. In this period he formulated his materialism of the encounter or aleatory materialism, talking to Breton and Navarro about it, that first appeared in Écrits philosophiques et politiques and later in the 2006 verso book Philosophy of the Encounter. In 1987, after Althusser underwent an emergency operation because of the obstruction of the esophagus, he developed a new clinical picture of depression. First brought to the Soisy-sur-Seine clinic, he was transferred to the psychiatric institution MGN in La Verrière. There, following a pneumonia contracted during the summer, he died of a heart attack on October 22, 1990. Althusser was such a homely person that biographer William S. Lewis affirmed, Althusser had known only home, school, and POW camp by the time he met his future wife. In contrast, when he first met Hélène in 1946, she was a former member of the French resistance and a communist activist. After fighting along with Jean Beaufret in the group Service Pericles, she joined the PCF. However, she was expelled from the party accused of being a double agent for Gestapo, for Trotskyist deviation and crimes, which probably referred to the execution of former Nazi